Pandora's box. What was really inside? One of the most famous questions in human history may be this: what was really inside Pandora's box? We hear this story from childhood. There is a woman. She has a forbidden box. She gives in to curiosity. She opens the lid, and all the evils of the world spread out, and only hope remains behind. The story sounds short, but in truth, this myth is much more than a simple tale, because the question of what was inside Pandora's box does not only tell us what was in a myth, it also tells us about human nature, the meaning of suffering, the true value of hope, and even how the ancient world looked at women. And the most interesting part is this: Pandora did not even originally have a box. Yes, you heard that right. What everyone today calls Pandora's box was not a box in the earliest versions. It was a large clay jar. So even from the very beginning, the story we think we know was already incomplete. So come with me. Let us descend into the deepest part of this myth together. This time, we will open the lid ourselves, and we will see what was really inside. Everything begins with the great tension between the gods and humanity, especially the conflict between Zeus and Prometheus. Prometheus is not an ordinary figure. He is a titan. He is clever. He is far-seeing, and he feels a deep closeness toward humanity. He wants to protect human beings. He wants to give them not just a chance to live, but power as well. But for Zeus, humans are creatures that must remain under control. They must stay weak. They must never question the absolute order of the gods. Prometheus breaks that balance. First he tricks Zeus in the matter of sacrificial portions. Then he steals fire so that humanity can advance, and brings it down to earth. Fire does not only mean warmth. Fire means knowledge. It means craft. It means cooking food, shaping metal, breaking through the darkness, resisting nature itself. Fire is humanity's first great tool of freedom. And when Prometheus steals it from the gods and gives it to mankind, Zeus does not merely become angry. He also realizes that humanity has now entered a path that cannot be reversed. And this is exactly where Pandora's story begins. Because Pandora is Zeus's direct punishment. Zeus does not want the gift of fire to go unanswered. If Prometheus has brought humanity a gift, then Zeus will send them another gift in return. But this gift will not be what it seems. Beautiful on the outside, destructive on the inside. In other words, Pandora is not truly a gift. She is a decorated trap. Zeus gives an order to the gods. Hephaestus shapes clay and forms the body of the first woman. Athena gives her skill and grace. Aphrodite adds charm, desire, and breathtaking beauty. Hermes gives her persuasion, cunning, and a tongue that can deceive when needed. Other gods also add their own gifts. And so what emerges is not an ordinary human being, but a dazzling, captivating, radiant figure in every way. That is why her name becomes Pandora, the one gifted by all. But the irony here matters greatly, because the gifts Pandora receives are not only beauty and talent. Hidden inside them are seduction, deception, curiosity, persuasion, and the seeds of disaster. So while Pandora appears from the outside like a miracle, within her she carries Zeus's plan. She is made like a human being, but her purpose is to test humanity. It is worth pausing here for a moment. Why does Zeus not simply punish mankind by striking them with lightning? Why does he not openly try to destroy them? Why does he instead place a figure, a story, and an object into their lives? because some punishments are heavier than death. To vanish in a single moment is one thing, but to live slowly with pain, to learn how to endure it day after day, in the eyes of ancient myth, that is a far harsher fate. And Pandora is the beginning of that fate. She is not a war. She is not a storm of destruction. She is a turning point placed inside everyday life. She is fate entering a household. She is the great change that begins quietly. Pandora is then sent to Prometheus. Prometheus is the brother of Prometheus. But unlike his brother, he is not forward-thinking. Prometheus, as his name suggests, is the one who thinks ahead, the one who sees before things happen. Prometheus is the one who thinks after, the one who realizes the truth only when it is too late. Even this is deeply symbolic. Prometheus had already warned his brother not to accept any gift from Zeus. The danger was known in advance. But Prometheus is overcome by beauty. He forgets the warning. He accepts Pandora. And in that moment, disaster is not forced into the home. It is welcomed inside. Here the myth says something painfully true about human nature. Very often, what destroys us is not the evil that attacks from outside. It is the thing we ourselves invite in because we are enchanted by it. Danger does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a gift. Sometimes it arrives with a beautiful face. Sometimes it takes the shape of a mystery that awakens desire. And then, the famous object appears. Today, everyone calls it a box. But the word used in ancient Greek texts is pithos. A pithos is a large clay jar, a great storage vessel. In the ancient world, grain, oil, wine, and other valuable things were kept in such jars. So the object in Pandora's hands was not a small, elegant, ornamental jewel box. It was something much heavier. Something ordinary, but also deeply mysterious. This detail may sound unimportant, but in truth, it changes the whole mood of the story. A box feels more personal, more secretive, more delicate. A jar feels older, more tied to the earth, more ritualistic. It is as if the object is not just a container, but a burden rising from the deep roots of the world itself. That is why what Pandora carries is not a simple item. It is the sealed vessel of fate. So why was this vessel given to Pandora? In some versions, Zeus places it directly in her hands. In others, the vessel is already in the house, standing somewhere within her reach. But in every version, the shared point is the same. It must not be opened. That means the essence of the object is the prohibition itself. What lies inside is unknown. And perhaps that is where its true power lies. Human beings are often not drawn in by certain danger, but by uncertainty. Not knowing what something is can make the desire to open it even stronger. Because the human mind does not like emptiness. It wants to fill in what is hidden. It wants to see what stands behind the closed thing. A prohibition feeds curiosity. And this is why Pandora's story is not only the story of one woman's mistake. It is a mythic expression of one of the deepest tendencies of the human mind. We want to see. We want to know. We want to touch. And sometimes, we only learn the cost after the lid has already been lifted. At last, Pandora opens the vessel. This is the moment everyone knows. But very few people stop to think about what actually came out from beneath that lid. In children's books, it is usually described like this: disease, war, famine, death, jealousy, lies, sorrow, hatred, and many other evils. That version is very common. But the earliest ancient sources do not give such a detailed list. And that is where the true power of the old versions lies. Instead of presenting a precise catalog, they show a terrifying abundance that remains partly undefined. In Hesiod's telling, countless troubles pour out into the world from this vessel. Burdens humanity had never known before: sickness, grinding labor, invisible pain, quietly arriving suffering. Until then, perhaps human beings were not completely free of hardship, but life had not been as heavy as it would become. When Pandora opens the vessel, human existence becomes unavoidably more difficult. So what comes out is not merely a handful of bad emotions. It is the weight of being human itself. There's a very important distinction here. In many modern retellings, what comes out of Pandora's vessel is shown like demonic beings, as if black smoke, evil spirits, or visible monsters burst out into the world. But in ancient thought, most of these are not physical creatures. They are invisible forces that seep into life itself, like illness, like exhaustion, like despair, like old age, like the endless burden of work, like the pains that slowly gather on the body and the soul. In other words, what was inside Pandora's vessel was something even more frightening than sharp-toothed monsters. It was unseen suffering, suffering that becomes normal, suffering that slips quietly into every ordinary day. Because human beings can declare war on sudden disaster, but the troubles that settle into everyday life, those must be endured. And perhaps that is exactly why the myth of Pandora has lasted so long. Because the evil it describes is not a single apocalypse. It is the fragile sorrow that walks beside human life at every step. Think about it. You wake up in the morning, and there is weariness. You have to work. There is fear of loss. There is the possibility that the people you love may fall ill. There is time passing. There is the chance of betrayal. There is the possibility of making the wrong choice. There is the pain of giving effort and receiving nothing in return. There is jealousy, heartbreak, guilt, regret, longing, and fear of death. These are the things that came out of Pandora's vessel. Invisible burdens that do not destroy a person in an instant, but make life heavier every day. That is why some interpreters say, when Pandora opened the vessel, the world became tragic for the first time. Human life stopped being mere existence. It became a struggle. But now we come to the greatest question of all. If all the evils came out of the vessel, what was left inside? Everyone thinks they know the answer: hope. But here the story becomes far darker than most people realize. Because yes, hope remained inside. But what exactly does that mean? In the ancient Greek text, the thing left behind is called elpis. This word is often translated as hope. But it does not mean only hope. It can also mean expectation, the state of waiting for something, the anticipation of what may come. So what remained inside? Was it a bright and comforting hope? Or was it merely an uncertain expectation that keeps human beings suspended in doubt? That is the question scholars have debated for centuries. According to one interpretation, when Pandora managed to close the lid again, hope remained inside, and this is good for humanity. Because even if all the evils have spread into the world, human beings can still endure because of hope. They suffer. They fall ill. They lose. They age. But still, they carry a small feeling that tomorrow may be better. This is the most common interpretation today. People prefer to hear the story this way, because this version offers comfort. No matter how many disasters have escaped, At least hope remains with us. That is why in many modern retellings, the myth begins in darkness but ends with a glimmer of light, as if after taking everything else away, the gods still left humanity one tiny force that could help them continue. But there is another interpretation, and it is much harsher. According to this one, hope remained inside because Zeus withheld it from humanity. In other words, all suffering spread out across the world, but the one thing that might have made that suffering easier to bear never reached human beings at all. If that is true, then the story is not comforting. It is brutally cruel. Humanity is left alone with pain, forced to live without secure confidence in the future. This reading reveals just how severe the myth really is. Because Zeus is not trying to reward humanity. He is trying to punish it. So why would he allow something as precious as hope to escape? Maybe he never did. Maybe hope was kept away from mankind from the very beginning. There's a third interpretation as well. And perhaps it is the most human of all. In this version, the Elpis left inside is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. Hope is the force that keeps a person alive. But it can also deceive. Sometimes people endure because they hope. But sometimes people fail to see reality because they hope too much. They believe a broken system will change. And it never does. They tolerate injustice because they think one day things will improve. They postpone confronting pain because they believe tomorrow will rescue them. So hope can be a medicine, but it can also be a chain. This is where the true depth of the Pandora myth lies. The story does not hand you a simple moral lesson. It makes you feel as though you are living inside a riddle. So when we return to the question of what was really inside Pandora's vessel, perhaps it is more accurate to say that it contained not a specific set of objects, but every form of suffering that shapes human existence. Disease was there. Fear of death was there. Endless labor was there. Fragility was there. Loss was there. Physical decay was there. Emotional heaviness was there. Deception was there. Distrust was there. And most importantly, there was limitation. The kind of limitation humanity had not yet fully felt. When Pandora opens the vessel, human beings do not merely learn that they are mortal. They begin to feel it. They internalize the fragility of life. That is why this vessel is not simply a container of evils. It is the container of tragic human consciousness itself. In ancient Greek thought, there is a sequence of ages. The Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and then increasingly harsher periods of human existence. The myth of Pandora belongs to this larger story of decline. So it is not only telling one event, it is explaining why humanity is no longer as peaceful as it once was. It explains why we must work, why we grow sick, why we live beneath the shadow of death. Many things that seem natural to us today were seen in ancient thought as the result of a break, a fall from an earlier state. Labor is treated almost like punishment. Suffering is told as a burden that arrived later. In this sense, the myth of Pandora is a powerful example of humanity trying to make sense of worldly pain. Because people have always asked the same questions. Why is life hard? Why does misery exist? Why is there death? Why must we lose what we love? Pandora's vessel is a mythic answer to all of those questions. But the story has another side as well. And for the modern listener, it can be deeply unsettling. Pandora is often described as the first woman, and she is placed at the beginning of humanity's suffering. That is not accidental. Some ancient texts tend to portray women as the source of desire, temptation, consumption, and disorder. Pandora is one of the oldest and strongest examples of that pattern. She is made beautiful. She is alluring. And with her arrival, pain enters the world. Because of this, some scholars read the myth of Pandora not only as a cosmic disaster story, but also as a mythic foundation for the unfair suspicions and accusations directed at women throughout history. In that sense, Pandora's vessel carried not only suffering, but also an injustice that would echo across centuries. This matters deeply, because modern culture has often repeated the story in a simple form. The woman who ruined the world because she was too curious. But the real architect of the trap is Zeus. Zeus designs the punishment. Zeus orders Pandora to be made this way. Zeus establishes the prohibition. Zeus sets the snare in place. Pandora's curiosity is only the final spark. She is not the mastermind of the disaster. In a sense, she too is a tragic figure placed inside a divine game. She is judged for her curiosity. But the real force behind the story is the power that shaped her and positioned her there in the first place. At this point, another question naturally appears. If the original object was a jar, then why do we still call it Pandora's box? The answer lies not in ancient Greece, but in much later centuries. During the Renaissance, some translations and retellings began rendering the Greek word pithos as a different kind of container. Over time, that shifted into the image of a small box. Especially in European art and literature, it seemed more striking to show Pandora carrying a delicate, portable, mysterious box. And so the jar was forgotten, while the box remained. But this change is not only visual. The movement from jar to box changes the whole atmosphere of the myth. The jar feels more ancient, more earthy, more ritualistic. The box feels more personal, more secretive, more like a fairy tale. So the Pandora image we carry today is actually a mixture of ancient texts and the imagination of later centuries. It is also important to remember this. Ancient myths were not fixed stories in the way modern books are. Different poets, different thinkers, and different periods told the same story in different tones. That is why the exact list of what escaped from Pandora's vessel is never the same everywhere. In some versions, moral flaws are emphasized. In others, physical suffering. In still others, social disasters. But in all versions, the central truth remains unchanged. Whatever makes human life harder, whatever robs it of ease, whatever wears down body and soul, all of that is traced back to the opening of that lid. So Pandora's vessel is not just a place where separate things were stored. It is the symbol of a principle. Suffering unleashed through transgression. Destiny awakened through curiosity. A forbidden boundary crossed. And a new world born from that crossing. Sometimes the myth is interpreted as saying, curiosity is bad. But I think it says something more complicated than that. Because curiosity is one of the things that makes us human. Science is born from curiosity. Discovery begins with curiosity. Prometheus too crossed a boundary. So did Pandora. In one case, the crossing brings knowledge and power. In the other, it releases suffering. It is as if the myth is telling us this. Not every open door leads to liberation. Not every hidden thing contains truth we are ready to bear. Some knowledge may be heavier than the soul can carry. And yet, human beings cannot stop being curious. Because not knowing is also a kind of pain. That is why it is easy to blame Pandora. But incomplete. Her action contains one of humanity's deepest instincts: to know, to see, to understand, no matter the cost. And that is exactly why the myth of Pandora still feels so powerful today. Because in the modern world, we are still opening boxes. We chase forbidden knowledge. We unleash technologies. We seek power. And in trying to control it, we create new dangers. We bring into the world systems, machines, ideas, and experiments without fully understanding what may come out of them. And then later, we look back and ask, what did we release? Perhaps that is why Pandora's vessel never grows old. It is not only an object from ancient Greece. It is the symbol of every dangerous threshold humanity has opened with its own hands. From nuclear power to artificial intelligence, from biological experimentation to mass manipulation, mankind still lives within the same tension. We want knowledge. We want strength. We want control. But sometimes, what we open cannot be closed again. And yet, the most moving part of the story may be this: in spite of everything, human beings continue to live. Once Pandora opens the vessel, the world never returns to what it was before. The sorrows are not gathered back in. Disease does not vanish. Death does not disappear. Difficulty does not end. But human beings still build homes. They raise children. They sing songs. They plant the earth. They sail the seas. They found cities. They create art. They grieve. And then they love again. This is where the question of hope becomes important once more. Whether hope truly escaped, or whether it remained trapped inside. Humanity somehow created its shadow for itself. Because human beings are not only creatures that carry pain, they are creatures that search for meaning. And that is exactly what myths do. They do not erase suffering, but they give it shape. That is why Pandora's vessel is not only the beginning of disaster, it is also the beginning of meaning. Now, let us think of the story in a much simpler way for a moment. There is a container. Inside it are invisible things that will change the world. Someone opens the lid, and after that moment, human life becomes irreversibly harder. This scene can also be read as the transition from childhood to adulthood. For a while, a person imagines the world to be safe, simple, and understandable. Then one day, the lid is opened. Pain is encountered. Loss becomes real. Death is understood. Betrayal, loneliness, fear, and responsibility appear. And the person can never return to the old innocence again. In that sense, the myth of Pandora may be not only the collective story of humanity, but also the inner story of every individual life. One day, all of us open our own Pandora's vessel. And after that, we must live with the heavier, truer face of existence. So then, what was really inside Pandora's box? The most honest answer may be this: inside were all the things human beings cannot escape. Disease was there. Labor was there. Old age was there. The shadow of death was there. Loss was there. Anxiety was there. The weight of effort was there. Deception was there. And above all, fragility was there. Because that is the essence of suffering. The moment a human being understands that they are not invincible, Pandora's vessel has already been opened. But another truth is hidden in the same story. To know pain does not only weaken a person, it also deepens them. It makes compassion possible. It teaches endurance. It creates the need to tell stories. Perhaps that is why this myth has been told for thousands of years. Because everyone recognizes something from their own life in what came out of that vessel. When you lose someone you love, one of the things from Pandora's vessel has entered your home. When you lie awake at night thinking about the future, the shadow of that vessel is in your room. When you give your effort and receive nothing in return, when you are betrayed, when you receive news of illness, when you realize that you are growing older, when you try to breathe through a season of life that feels too heavy to cross, that ancient myth suddenly comes very close to you. Because even if the story changes, human suffering changes very little. The names are different, the forms are different, the centuries are different, but the essence remains the same. That is why Pandora's vessel still feels like more than a mythological object today. It feels like a summary of the human experience itself. And still, despite all the darkness, it would be incomplete to see this only as a story of curse and ruin. Because the most astonishing thing about humanity is this: even while fully aware of suffering, human beings continue to create beauty. If what escaped from Pandora's vessel had been only destruction, humanity would have surrendered long ago. But it does not surrender. Because alongside pain, there is resilience. Alongside fragility, there is courage. Alongside loss, there is memory. Even beneath the shadow of death, there is still the desire to love. That is why even if the meaning of hope remains uncertain, humanity has managed to rebuild it from within. Maybe the gods did not leave hope behind. Maybe they did. Maybe they left only expectation. But human beings learned how to imagine light even in the middle of darkness. And at this point, the myth of Pandora gives us a lesson that is harsh, but deeply true. We cannot erase every suffering in the world. We cannot fully reseal what has already been opened. We cannot make life completely safe. We cannot cancel death. We cannot remove loss from existence. But we can understand what we are facing. We can name pain. We can turn it into story. And perhaps most importantly, we can realize that we are not alone inside it. Because that is the power of myth. If a tale spoken thousands of years ago can still explain your fear, your exhaustion, your curiosity, and your hope today, then there is a truth inside it that is larger than time itself. In the end, we think we have learned what was inside Pandora's box, but perhaps what we truly learn is something else. Inside that vessel, there were not only evils. There was the cost of being human. There was the weight of living. And there was also the hidden courage required to continue in spite of it. Maybe hope remained inside. Maybe it never escaped. Maybe it never vanished at all, and only changed its form. But one thing is certain. The moment Pandora opened the lid, the world did not only become a more painful place, it also became a more conscious one. Humanity became not just a species that lives, but a species that knows what is missing, feels what has been lost, and still walks toward tomorrow. That is why the question of what was really inside Pandora's box cannot be answered with a single word. Yes, disease was there. Sorrow was there. The shadow of death was there. But beneath all of that, there was something deeper. Human fate was there. The inevitable cracks in human life were there. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. What spread into the world when the vessel was opened was not merely evil. It was reality itself. The heavy face of life that had been hidden until that moment. That is why the story of Pandora is so frightening. because it does not really tell us about monsters. It tells us about our own lives. And perhaps that is why it is unforgettable. Because whatever escaped from that ancient jar is still here with us now. But now let us return one last time to the first question. What was really inside Pandora's box? Perhaps the answer is this. You were there. I was there. The entire fragility of being human was there. All our pain was there. All our expectations were there. All our endurance was there. Our vulnerable bodies were there. Our fears were there. Our endless questions were there. Our losses were there. And in the middle of all of it, the part of us that still refuses to stop living was there too. That is why Pandora's box is not just an open container. It is a mirror of the human soul. When you look into it, you do not see only a myth. You see yourself. And perhaps that is why this story still feels so close, even after thousands of years. Because the box has already been opened. And we are still learning how to live with what came out of it.